Hello, and welcome to the second video in my series on writing progressive metal or DJENT guitar riffs. In the first video in the series, I talked a little bit about polymeter and syncopation, two very important rhythmic ideas for the DJENT feel, for bands like Meshuggah, Periphery, Animals as Leaders, and Tesseract, and Viltiarta, and whoever else that comes to mind for you. In this video, I'll be focusing on an idea that is more generally applicable to any kind of music, but which is very important in the style for progressive metal. That is the idea of using motifs in your writing. So a motif is basically the smallest recognizable and repeated part of a musical idea. The classic and classical example is Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, the dun 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 dun. That gets repeated over and over again in different variations, creating essentially the entire piece. When we use motifs in our writing, it allows us to basically create more cohesive feeling pieces of music. So it doesn't feel like we're just going from idea to idea. It allows us to have a little bit more logic connecting the different sections. When it comes to metal writing, specifically, one of the best examples of the use of motifs is Enter Sandman by Metallica. We have the core riff of... and so on. That riff is constructed from two different motifs. We have... and we have... That riff basically gives the seed that the rest of the song is written from, which sort of shows why it matters to use motifs when we're writing. So when we think about Enter Sandman again, when we go into the verse, we have something along the lines of... So we can see that it's basically just chugging. We have this we have the little slide up, and then we have a return to that sort of punctuation mark power chord motif from the original riff. So basically, we get two for the price of one when it comes to writing sections of the song. When it comes specifically to writing progressive metal or DJENT, Meshuggah would be the masters of using motifs. For instance, in Guitar Pro here, I'll probably give anybody else who has picked up an 8-string because of Meshuggah flashbacks if I do this. Just 3/16 notes followed by an 8th note. That would be the core rhythmic motif used in Bleed. Basically, the majority of the song is created from playing around with that motif. As an example of how Meshuggah uses motifs for writing and developing songs, can take a look at Do Not Look Down. So here, one thing that I've done to make the guitar part a little bit more comprehensible is that I've written this out in terms of just what the guitar is doing. So we can see that it's alternating between 11/8 and 3/4. So if we take a listen to this. It should be pretty clear that we are basically going back and forth between two different ideas. Dun, 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 and da 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 da. And if we take a look at the verse riff, we might be able to notice that it's really the same core idea. It's just a variation on both motifs, but it's still following the same kind of pattern. Dun 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 da 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 dun 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 dun. So we can see that by using the key motif there, we have gotten, again, just like Enter Sandman, we've gotten two for the price of one. We both get our intro and our verse from the same key idea. The way that Meshuggah often uses motivic variations is for the sake of basically adding or removing a note so that the feel of the riff changes each time it comes around. Basically, the placement of the riff relative to the drums changes if we remove a note or add a note. That isn't happening here, but this song is particularly good for recognizing how we can use motifs in both structuring an individual riff and turning that into a larger song. So I'm just going to fiddle around a little bit here and see if I come up with something. I might have to pause the recording if I can't come up with anything good, but let's see here. Let's do like a... Okay, there's something there. I'll pause and try transcribing that. All right, so I'll stick with just the core idea of what I had there. So transcribing it out, what I'd get is... So going back to one of the ideas that I talked about in the last video, the idea of polymeter, one thing that we might be able to see is that the implied rhythmic structure for the guitar is, again, different from the 4/4 pulse. Looking at it, I guess this would technically be a bar of 7/8 followed by a bar of 4/4 for the underlying guitar phrasing, which means that we're still staying out of alignment with the 4/4 pulse. So at this point, I have a core idea, and we can see that even now, it's built out of a couple of motifs that I can identify and use to figure out how I want to continue the riff. So at this point, for this to feel cohesive, one thing that I can do is make sure to reuse some of those concepts. Like, okay, let's say that I'll reuse the chugging here. At this point, let's say that I want to play around with this and mutate it a little bit. So let's say instead, let's linger on that end of the gallop. For this to have a proper contrast, what we probably should do is move upwards in some way. Now, especially since I have a slide in there, that gives me a lot of room to basically move around the fretboard. Let's say that I slide up to the A. That would be sliding up to the 5th. So we slide from the 5th of the scale. So we'll slide from the 5 up to the 12. I do kind of want to have something that brings this to a bit of a conclusive feel. And one thing that I'm thinking about, not those notes, definitely not those notes. So one thing as I'm fiddling around here that's coming to mind is that it might be good to end with some chords. Everything that I've done so far in the riff has been based on using just single notes. So instead, let's do some chords here. But to make this feel cohesive, what I'll do is I'll look back at what I've already done and use that as a reference point for what I'll do next. So I'll keep the same interval motion here. So sliding from the A to the C, transposing that up to E here, that would be sliding from E to G. But I do want to turn this into some kind of chord thing. So rather than sliding, let's say, it feels a little bit twee. What I'll do is we'll turn that into a chord and reuse a little bit of the previous idea. So going back to that core concept here of the motif, which I'm kind of using as a motif in and of itself in this video, we have, if we just look at the rhythm, quarter note, then the classic gallop, quarter note, eighth note. So I can reuse that here. We have a quarter note chord, and I'll insert a classic gallop in between, and have a dotted eighth note or dotted quarter note chord there instead of having the quarter note followed by eighth note that we're sliding into. And that does leave us one beat short. That's not necessarily a problem. We can just hit in another eighth note and not quite the move. Let's see, let's do instead. Okay. Yeah, that works a little bit better. So let's hear this from beginning to end there. All right, so I think that that's working decently well for something that I'm coming up with on the fly here. So relating this back to the sort of core ideas that I'm trying to emphasize here, we have some key motifs that I'm using, and I'm building the overall riff by thinking about how can I reuse those motifs and how can I alter them so that it follows the sort of arc that I want it to. So when we're thinking about using motifs in music, the motif is that smallest identifiable and repeated piece of music. And when we are specifically writing progressive metal, we can create more elaborate riffs by basically taking a few key ideas and then playing around with them. It means that you don't need to come up with 16 bars or whatever all at once. Instead, you can come up with just a couple of ideas and then mutate them so you get that longer run-on sentence feel that you get with some bands like Viljarta and Periphery. So if you found this helpful, make sure to like the video. If you're not already subscribed, make sure to subscribe to the channel, and I'll hopefully see you next time.